ready to explore a different side of philosophy. We're diving into the world of pragmatic arguments.
Pragmatic arguments.
Yeah. As a philosopher, we're always focused on logic and evidence.
Right.
Well, with these pragmatic arguments, it's not so much about proving if something's true. It's more about, well, what happens if you just choose to believe it?
It's like asking, what if I just go ahead and say this lucky charm works? Will that lead to a better outcome? You're kind of looking at those what ifs, weighing those consequences.
So instead of getting stuck on, is it true?
Yeah.
It's more like, okay, what if it were true, and then what? Like a thought experiment almost.
Yeah. It's a way of looking at beliefs, but through this practical lens. And you might be surprised to know that even ancient philosophers, like Plato, they kind of dabbled in this type of reasoning.
Really?
Yeah. Plato, he argued that seeking knowledge, even if we don't find all the answers, that it makes us better, makes us braver, more active. So the belief in inquiry itself has positive consequences, regardless of the outcome.
It's like saying, hey, even if this workout doesn't get me a six-pack, it's still good for my health overall.
Right.
The process itself has value. But let's break this down a bit more. What are the different types of pragmatic arguments?
So one way to look at them is whether the benefits of believing depend on the belief actually being true.
Okay.
And one really famous example is Pascal's wager.
Ah, Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
The big bet on whether God exists.
Exactly.
Huge reward if you win.
Eternal damnation if you're wrong. Yeah.
High stakes.
Really high stakes. So Pascal, he argued that the potential payoff of believing in God, even if the odds are uncertain, is so big that it's the most rational bet you can make.
Okay, so that makes sense. But the reward only comes if God actually exists.
That's right. The bet hinges on the truth of the belief. So that's what we call a dependent argument.
Dependent. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
But what about those where the benefits come regardless of whether it's actually true?
Right, so that would be an independent argument. And a classic example of that comes from David Hume, who was famously a skeptic. He argued that religion, even if it might be based on some flawed premises, it can still be beneficial because it promotes morality and social order.
It's like saying even if the stories aren't literally true, that moral framework can still be valuable.
Right.
Okay, so you have these different types of pragmatic arguments that play out in these different ways. But I want to kind of look at this with our philosopher hats on for a second. Can you see believing in God as being morally advantageous, even if you don't have, like, definitive proof?
That is a great question, and that question has fueled so many philosophical debates. Robert Adams, for example, he argued that believing in a moral order, which is something that theism supports with this concept of a divine lawgiver, combats demoralization, which he sees as just inherently bad.
Just like believing in God is a way to keep us from just descending into this nihilistic chaos. And I could definitely see how that could be seen as a moral benefit. Are there other philosophers who have made this connection between belief and morality?
Absolutely. Linda Zagzebski took that argument even a step further. She said it's only rational to be moral if you believe it's likely to succeed. And a moral order, which theism gives us, makes that success more likely.
So it's not just about avoiding bad behavior. It's also about having faith that goodness will ultimately win in the end. And that can be a really powerful motivator. But couldn't someone argue that other beliefs, not just theism, can also support a moral order and inspire good behavior?
You're absolutely right. And that's where these arguments are really debated, is whether or not they give theistic belief some sort of unique advantage, morally speaking.
Right. So maybe these arguments aren't a slam dunk, but I want to bring up William James and his idea of the will to believe. He was saying that sometimes it's okay to just take that leap of faith, even when the evidence is kind of iffy. Could that apply here?
James was such a fascinating thinker, wasn't he? He basically challenged this idea that we should always withhold belief when the evidence is missing.
Yeah.
He called it the agnostic imperative and argued that sometimes taking a leap of faith, well, that can be how you get to certain truths.
It's almost like saying, I choose to believe in love, even though I can't scientifically prove that it's real.
Right.
But are there specific situations where James thought this leap of faith was justified?
Oh, yeah, he actually outlined those. He called them genuine options.
Okay.
And these genuine options, they have to be living, momentous, forced, and intellectually open.
Okay, so break those down for me.
Okay, so living means the belief has to be like a real possibility for the person.
Okay.
Momentous, meaning that it has significant consequences. Forced means that there is no neutral option. You either have to believe or not believe.
Okay.
And then intellectually open, meaning that the evidence doesn't give you a clear answer.
Okay. So basically, they're beliefs about things that really matter, where the stakes are high and where you just don't have enough evidence to make a clear decision.
Exactly. And in these situations, James argued that our passions, our desires, they can play a legitimate role in how we form our beliefs.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he even said that religious belief might fall into this category of genuine options.
Hmm. So if someone is wrestling with this question of whether God exists, and it has a huge impact on how they live their life, then maybe it's okay for them to choose to believe, even if they don't have absolute proof.
That was his argument. Yeah, he believed that the potential benefits of religious belief, like finding meaning and purpose and hope, they outweigh the risks of potentially being wrong. It's a very different perspective than, say, J.S. Mill, who proposed this concept of a license to hope.
Okay, so we're moving from leap of faith to a license to hope.
Yeah. Mill, he thought that hope, well, had a lower bar than belief. You don't need to have solid evidence to hope for something. As long as it's possible and it makes you or others happier, then he said, go ahead, hope for it.
That's a nice thought. Hope feels much more accessible than belief. But how does this idea of a license to hope play out when we're talking about theism? Could you have faith based on hope that God exists, even if you don't fully believe?
Well, that's where things get a little complicated. You see, it's kind of like hoping you win the lottery, even though you know the odds are really against you. You might act like you're going to win, but deep down you probably know it's not going to happen. And then that brings us to this interesting problem of catching belief.
Catching belief, what is that?
It's this idea that if you act as if you believe something consistently, you're more likely to actually start believing it.
It's like faking it till you make it for beliefs.
Exactly, like smiling until you actually feel happy. So if you are hoping in the realm of faith, you have to be very aware of that potential shift into actually believing it.
So it's almost like walking a tightrope with hope. You're acknowledging that something is possible, but you're also trying not to trick yourself into thinking that it's definitely true. It's a tough balance. But let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking about Pascal and James and Mill, all focusing on this rational side of faith. But what about the idea that belief in God just fulfills a deep human need?
Now, that's a really compelling perspective, and it's one that quite a few philosophers have explored. Like James Beattie, for example, he argued that criticizing religion, as someone like David Hume did, might be taking away a source of comfort for people, especially during times of suffering.
So even if those beliefs aren't based on evidence, they can act like a sort of safety net. So is it even ethical to take that away from people?
That's the heart of Beattie's argument. And John Henry Newman, he was a 19th century theologian, made a similar point with his factory girl argument. He describes this young woman who is facing death, and her belief in God, that's the only thing giving her hope.
It's a powerful illustration of how much we as humans crave meaning, especially when things are really tough.
Right. Religion can offer that. But these arguments also bring up some big questions, like, are those needs for comfort and meaning universal? And are there other ways to fulfill them besides religion?
It seems like we keep coming back to this idea of weighing the pros and cons, not just of believing in something, but of not believing in something.
Yeah.
It's a really complicated equation. But speaking of complicated, how about we tackle the big one? Pragmatic arguments and the meaning of life itself.
Now we're getting into it. This is where all those questions about purpose and significance really come into play.
Right. I mean, we've all heard the phrase God-shaped hole.
Mhm.
So is there something inherently meaningful about living your life in relation to a divine being?
Huh.
Does belief in God fill that hole for some people?
Well, that idea, although he didn't use those exact words, was really central to Pascal's thinking. He believed that we as humans are always looking for happiness and fulfillment, and without faith, we're always going to be searching.
Okay.
And that only a relationship with God can really satisfy that longing.
So it's like we're wired for a connection with the divine, and nothing else can quite replace that.
Right. But other philosophers, they take a slightly different approach.
Okay.
Some, like William Lane Craig, they argue that God is absolutely essential for meaning. Without God, life is just pointless and absurd and meaningless.
That's a much more pessimistic perspective.
It is.
But couldn't you also make the argument that God simply enhances meaning instead of being like the only source of it?
Absolutely.
So maybe our lives have inherent value, but then believing in God just adds another dimension of meaning.
It's like saying, yeah, a sunset is beautiful, but knowing that it was created by a divine artist, that just makes it even more amazing.
I like that. It really shows how people can experience meaning and purpose in different ways. But what about the idea of immortality? How does that fit into all of this?
Immortality is a huge factor in these arguments. If we think about it, if our lives are finite, then everything we do, all our accomplishments, our memories, they all eventually disappear.
Right.
But if we have an eternal soul, then our actions have this eternal significance. And that belief, well, that can be really motivating for finding meaning.
Yeah, it's like the difference between writing a message in the sand and it getting washed away by the waves, or carving it into stone for everyone to see forever.
Exactly.
One is temporary, the other lasts.
Yeah.
But I want to kind of flip the script for a second. What about atheistic, pragmatic arguments? Are there arguments for not believing in God?
Oh, there definitely are. Some argue that belief in God can actually do more harm than good, makes the world a worse place. Remember Hume? Yeah, he was concerned that theistic beliefs could lead to things like blind obedience and fanaticism, and a focus on getting those otherworldly rewards rather than caring about what's happening down here on Earth.
So instead of encouraging good behavior, it could actually hold us back. That's a strong argument.
It is, and Freud went even further. He actually called religion an illusion that prevents us from growing up and taking responsibility for ourselves and our world.
No cosmic daddy to save us.
Right, we have to do it ourselves. And then you have Richard Dawkins. He calls religion a virus of the mind.
That's a harsh comparison.
It is. He thinks it spreads harmful ideas and discourages critical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I can see his point. If you're just blindly accepting what you're told without ever questioning anything, that doesn't really encourage intellectual freedom, does
It
it?
doesn't. And then you have Guy Kahan, a contemporary philosopher who offers a really unique perspective.
Okay.
He argues that even if God's existence did make the world a better place in some ways, we might still be better off without God.
Wait, so even if a God-created world was objectively better, we'd still choose to live in a godless one? I don't get it.
I know, it's a strange idea. He focuses on human autonomy, knowledge, and privacy. He says that if God exists, especially an all-knowing God, it could limit our freedom to choose our own values, it could limit our ability to truly understand the universe through science, and it could even violate our right to privacy of thought.
So it's about this tension between living in a perfectly ordered world and living in a world where humans have freedom and responsibility, even if things aren't perfect. That's a really difficult choice. But how do we decide which pragmatic arguments to go with? I mean, we've heard arguments for believing in God, arguments against it, arguments about the meaning of life. Where do we even begin to sort through all of this?
Well, that's what philosophy is all about, isn't it? It's not about having all the answers. It's about wrestling with these big questions and being open to different perspectives. Sometimes the biggest takeaway is realizing that there are multiple ways of looking at things.
It's like you're expanding your mind to consider possibilities you never even thought about before.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive into pragmatic arguments. I mean, we've seen how they can be used to support religious belief, challenge it, and even make sense of life itself. We've really explored some of the biggest questions that humans have ever asked.
And like any good philosophical journey, I think we've probably generated even more questions than we've answered.
Yeah. But hopefully this deep dive has given you some new ways to think about these ideas on your own.
Because the most important thing is to keep asking questions and keep exploring and keep diving deep into the world of philosophy.
That's right. So keep those philosophical gears turning, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.